but someone like me might have purchased a coal mine 6 years ago for pittance, because people told them this will never be permitted again.
Right.
And then
but
now,
it's coal.
Yes, exactly.
And you can burn it.
Yeah, and,
right.
and I would argue that with coal, the argument isn't so clear because you don't necessarily need it. Coal is a great source of energy, of course, in terms of its energy density, and in terms of the UK having a lot of coal nearby.
Cheap too.
Yeah, but with metals, it's easier to make that estimation. So just give you a very basic example. If the world truly wants to electrify the global fleet of cars, we basically don't really have enough copper to do that based on what we know today, the reserves, the economic reserves. So at the very least, we're going to be taking down a lot of mountains around the world if we want to get just the amount of copper that we're estimating, to sell 100 million cars a year. And the same is true of something like nickel, which is...
We can just solve that by forbidding people to have cars.
Well, that seems like what might happen. But with nickel, it's even easier. And with gold, it's the easiest.
Easiest in what way?
In terms of you're always at a shortage of gold. It's the hardest thing to get out of the ground. And it just keeps getting harder and harder and harder. So there's this difficulty curve. It's almost like...
Is it harder than uranium? Is it harder than even the heavy?
Oh, yeah. Uranium is quite abundant, actually. The thing about uranium is it needs to be enriched into U-208 or whatever U-2... and so that's the real cost in it. It's not the... there's quite a bit of uranium around the world, and its crustal abundance is it's not special at all.
So why is gold particularly rare?
That's a why question. So we will never know. There are theoretical physicists that postulate about neutron stars colliding and things like that, but I don't think we know the answers to these questions. I think it's a mystery why it is that we have this pre-given set of Legos.
Yeah. Okay.
And they seem to be in use since time immemorial. And in my book, there's appendices where I try and identify sort of the beginning of the use. It's kind of like when someone asks you, when was the wheel invented? When was the plow invented? When was writing invented? I don't think we know because in the extant texts that we have, the oldest, we already see a society, pregnant with this activity.
Right.
So we see in museums and in archaeological discoveries just not only this knowledge of the elements, the metals, but we see the techne, the ability to craft wonderful objects from these elements that have kind of moral significance. And so I think when you take a step back, which was what was happening to me in my 20s, and you look at the natural world with a sense of wonder, in terms of my biographical arc, I was starting to come back to the natural world. I was starting to see that the theoretical physics and those explanations of reality weren't going to satisfy my desire about the truth. But the natural world was. There was still that sense of wonder, that just like that question you asked that I can't answer. I don't know why gold is the way it is. It's just a pre-given reality. And so I, became quite fascinated with gold and also invested in gold mines. And at this point, I moved to Canada, to Toronto, where you're from, because that was kind of the mecca of mine finance. Toronto is the world's most important financial market for mining. And unlike in the United States, where the great majority of companies, at least before the last crash, are service industry companies, in Canada, the great majority are real mining companies. And all the best engineers and geologists and banks that know how to deal with these companies are based in Canada. So I learned a lot about that. I invested in it. And at some point, I made the mistake of trying to mine the gold. Because I felt like some of the mines were ready to go, or I invested in some companies that had mines that they had developed and were ready to mine. And that was when I realized how hard it was to actually make a profit mining. And I yearned for the days of value investing that my mentors used to tell me about. And it hit me one day just seeing these continued losses and unexpected, vagaries of nature. All of a sudden something just goes terribly wrong that you weren't predicting. All of a sudden there's a flood. And and I realized, you're actually better off just buying the gold and then holding on to it or using it than trying to get it out of the ground. It's cheaper. If you consider all of the costs, it's probably cheaper to do it that way.